Welcome to the Basics of Hazardous Waste Management, How to Make a Hazardous Waste Determination from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. RCRA is the law covering hazardous and solid waste management. It was created in 1976, and it creates cradle-to-grave responsibility for waste. That means once it's your waste, it's always your waste. It's continued to be updated over time and saw a large update in 1984 to close some loopholes and include more generators. There have been other updates since, and DEQ continues to adopt these updates to stay at least as stringent as the federal government, including recent updates to adopt the Generator Improvement Rule, the Pharmaceutical Rule, and others. On top of setting out management standards for waste, RCRA also sets out standards for landfills and recycling facilities. Now that you have a little bit of background on RCRA, let's get into how to make a hazardous waste determination. Failure to make this determination is one of the most common violations our inspectors see in the field. Follow these tips and you hopefully won't have that violation. Anytime you go to throw something away, you're required to conduct a hazardous waste determination. If I spilled soda on the counter, I would have knowledge that it's not a hazardous waste, but not everything's that easy. If you use a chemical, you might not know if it's hazardous or not. This has to be determined. There are two ways to conduct a hazardous waste determination: knowledge and analysis. And we're going to learn how to make these determinations today. Since the waste is being disposed of, documentation is all we have left to prove the waste went to the right place. Make sure you document everything and keep those documents and know how to access them in case of an emergency or when you're inspected. These are some important things to keep in mind when making a hazardous waste determination. First, make sure that the determination is made at the point of generation, before any dilution, mixing, or other alteration that may change the waste. Keep in mind that point of generation is both the time and the place the waste was first generated. SQGs and LQGs, that's small and large quantity generators, must maintain records, including records explaining knowledge basis for the determination. Although it's not required, it's a best practice for very small quantity generators, or VSQGs, to document this information as well. If testing is required, manage the waste as hazardous until lab results show otherwise. Label the waste with the words hazardous waste pending analysis, or just hazardous waste, an accumulation start date, and all other required labels. This way, if it is hazardous and you're inspected or there's an emergency, you're good to go. And if the waste ends up not being hazardous, you can take off the label without issue. And lastly, a determination must be made or remade if the waste changes composition or properties as a result of exposure to the environment or other factors. When making a hazardous waste determination, ask yourself these 5 questions in this order. This creates a structured and consistent way to identify your waste. Train your staff to do the same. You'll see page numbers either in the bottom corner or here next to the step. These go to the Small Quantity Generator Handbook from DEQ, which you can find more information and a link to in the video description. The first step to a hazardous waste determination is to ask yourself, is this a solid waste? And don't let the word solid trick you. Under RCRA, a solid waste is any solid, liquid, semi-solid sludge, or contained gas that's discarded. So it is abandoned, disposed of, burned, or incinerated. It can also be considered inherently waste-like. There are some materials that pose such a threat that they are always considered solid waste. That's inherently waste-like. One example of this is dioxin-containing wastes, because they pose such a significant threat to human health and the environment if released or mismanaged that they are never exempt from the definition of solid waste. This is to ensure that such wastes are subject to the most protective regulatory controls. And lastly, recycled wastes. Recycled wastes is a solid waste under RCRA because the material is at the end of its life and needs to be managed properly. Keep this in mind. Just because something is being recycled does not necessarily exempt it from RCRA regulations. There could be a whole training on recycling, reclaiming, and reusing wastes. Just know that you need to be careful in this area and always make a hazardous waste determination. Now that we know that to be a hazardous waste, our waste must first be a solid waste. And remember, not to let the word solid trick you. A solid waste can be solid, liquid, semi-solid sludge, or contained gas. But also remember, if it's not a solid waste, such as a product, it cannot be a hazardous waste. The next step in the hazardous waste determination is to ask yourself, is the waste excluded or exempt from RCRA regulations? Under RCRA, there are exclusions and exemptions. An exclusion excludes a material from the definition of solid or hazardous waste. This means that the material isn't covered by RCRA. An exemption covers materials that are solid and hazardous waste, but is exempt from RCRA rules for one reason or another. We'll look at some of these materials on the next slide. These wastes are excluded wastes in RCRA. Most of these are covered under the Clean Water Act, such as domestic sewage or industrial waste discharge. The third one there, secondary materials reclaimed and reused in the original process, was never really a waste. Think about it this way. You have a 2x4 that's 8 feet long. You cut off 4 feet and use it. The other 4 feet isn't waste. It can still be reused within that original process. You can find a longer list in the handbook and in the regulations. You'll remember exemptions are still solid and hazardous waste, but are exempt from RCRA regulations. These include things like reclaimed and recycled materials. Closed-loop recycling is exempt. However, the sludge from filters may still be a hazardous waste and needs a determination done on it. Exemptions do not count as hazardous waste as long as they're managed in accordance with the condition of that exemption. Even if you've determined your waste is exempt, periodically reevaluate to verify that the exemption remains true. Remember, RCRA kicks in if a waste is changed physically or chemically. Document all of your exemptions and keep that in your files. The Universal Waste Program was created by EPA to encourage recycling, improve compliance, and segregate certain materials from the regular garbage. These materials here are also generated by most businesses, and when managed properly, pose little threat to human health and the environment. Although these items are exempt if managed to the Universal Waste standards, and they don't have to count towards your hazardous waste totals, there are still rules that you need to follow to stay in compliance. Most universal waste items would be hazardous waste if not managed under these rules. Universal waste standards create streamlined regulations for certain hazardous wastes. These include batteries, pesticides, mercury-containing switches, mercury-containing lamps, and most recently, aerosol cans. Some of the benefits of the Universal Waste Program for small quantity handlers are longer accumulation timeframes, no need to ship with a hazardous waste manifest, no land disposal restrictions, no EPA ID number, as well as others. Now that we know our waste is a solid waste, it's not excluded or exempt, we need to find out if the waste is listed or not. There are two options you can use to make a hazardous waste determination: knowledge of process and product, and laboratory analysis. Knowledge of process and product includes safety data sheets. However, those only go so far. SDSs represent a virgin product. A process will almost always change or contaminate the original chemical. When considering what impacts a process can have on a waste, ask yourself, how does this operation or process affect the waste? Does it make the waste more concentrated, more diluted? Does it pick up contaminants along the way? So SDSs, labels, and supplier information can help. Trade associations might be another option. One critical factor in using knowledge for a hazardous waste determination is that the knowledge must be correct. In other words, the knowledge that is applied must be valid and verifiable. And don't forget to document it. Analysis means lab tests. If you have an unknown waste, this is the only way to classify it. Lab tests can be expensive. This is why labeling waste is so important. And remember, again, keep all of your documentation for at least 3 years. There are 4 types of listed wastes: F, K, P, and U. F and K wastes apply to process wastes. Knowledge is required for F and K wastes since the source and how they were produced matters. For F listing, think of spent solvents. P and U listed applies to pure, unused chemicals or chemicals that it is the sole active ingredient. And we're going to walk through each one of these one by one. The first category we're going to cover is spent solvent wastes, or F listed. There are 3 general criteria to be met for most F listings to apply. The waste must be used for its solvent properties, that is to solubilize or dissolve or mobilize other constituents. The solvent must be spent. That means it's been used and is no longer fit for use without being regenerated, reclaimed, or otherwise reprocessed. And third, the before use concentration needs to be 10% or higher. We'll look at this on the next slide. F wastes could be from spent solvent wastes, electroplating and other metal finishing wastes, wood preserving wastes, and more. Additionally, rags used with these spent solvents may also carry an F listing. But remember, the most common F listings have to be spent. If a new drum of acetone was knocked over by a forklift, it wouldn't be an F-listed waste. It wasn't spent. But the same acetone, once spent, would be an F-listed waste. Here's more on that before use concentration. In this example, solvent is used for cleaning parts and is no longer usable. It's spent. But before we used it, there was 5% carbon tetrachloride, which is an F001 listed waste, 2% methylene chloride, or F002 waste, and 5% of toluene, F005. Although there was 85% of other stuff in there, we had 12% total listed solvents. So when this becomes a waste, the waste codes F001, F002, and F005 apply because when you add them together, there was a total of 10% or more. Had those been 9% or lower, you wouldn't get one of these listings. K-listed wastes are from specific industrial processes. Most places should already know if they have one of these wastes, and 99% of you will probably never need to make this determination. The K wastes we see most often in Oregon is K001 for wood treaters. These listings are very specific. That K001 reads, bottom sediment sludge from the treatment of wastewater from wood-preserving processes that use creosote and/or pentachlorophenol. Take a look at the K-listed wastes, see if any of them apply to your industry, and if not, move on. Some examples of other industries that produce K-listed wastes include organic chemical manufacturing, pesticide manufacturing, petroleum refinery, and inorganic chemical manufacturing. The rules for P and U listed wastes were written for commercial chemical manufacturing, but they also come into play in other places. Remember, P and U listed chemicals are pure chemicals or the sole active ingredient. They're unused. A process waste cannot be P or U listed. And why would a pure chemical be a waste, you might ask? We see these as off-spec or expired or spilled before they were used. Some of these include unused acetone, like in our earlier example, benzene, mercury, and toluene. Some pesticides come into play as well. U-listed wastes are toxic. However, P-listed wastes are acutely toxic and can kill you quickly. They're regulated at just 2.2 pounds per month. That's much less than the 220 pounds per month that U-listed is regulated under. A note of caution when you're looking up your chemicals. Oftentimes chemicals go by different names. Think of methyl ethyl ketone. We often call it MEK. And if you're looking up one of the names and not the other, you might not find what you're looking for. So use things like chemical dictionaries or EPA's list of lists or the chemical abstract number to make sure that the waste you're looking for is the waste that you find. We're now on to step 4 of our hazardous waste determination process. Now that we know if our waste is a listed waste, that's the FK, P, or U, then we have to determine if the waste is a characteristic hazardous waste. Wastes can be both listed and characteristic, or just one or the other. Keep in mind, just because you have a listed hazardous waste doesn't mean you can stop there. Keep going through all 5 steps. There are again 4 types of characteristic wastes. However, unlike F, K, P, and U, these wastes are hazardous because of their physical or chemical characteristics. If a waste has one of these characteristics, then it's considered a hazardous waste. Let's take a look at these one by one. The first characteristic hazardous waste we're going to talk about is ignitable. An ignitable hazardous waste is a waste liquid with a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. A waste solid or gas that's capable, under standard temperature and pressure, of causing fire through friction, absorption of moisture, or chemical changes, and when ignited, creates a hazard. It's also chemicals that DOT classifies as oxidizers. Ignitable hazardous wastes carry the waste code D001. A fun fact about ignitable hazardous wastes: the reason EPA selected 140 degrees for the temperature is that during routine storage and transportation, things can reach that temperature. Think of a black drum sitting in the sun. It could easily hit less than 140 degrees. Keep in mind, a low flash point is bad. A high flash point is good. Some examples of ignitable hazardous wastes are petroleum parts washer solvents, solvent-based paint waste, and waste kerosene or gasoline. A corrosive hazardous waste is a waste liquid with a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5. EPA set this as the pH because soda syrup and fruit juice commonly has a pH of 2.5 to 3, and they didn't want to make your fruit juice a hazardous waste. A corrosive hazardous waste is also a waste liquid that corrodes steel at a rate of greater than 1/4 inch a year. Remember that those types of wastes should not be put in metal drums. You can chew right through them. Make sure to use a compatible container. These hazardous wastes receive the waste code of D002. Next, we have reactive wastes. These are waste materials reactive to water, shock, heat, or pressure, and they undergo a violent or rapid chemical reaction or generate toxic gases. These receive the waste code of D003. As some chemicals, such as peroxides, age, they can form crystals, which are highly unstable and reactive. Most businesses that work with reactive wastes should know it because storing and moving these wastes comes with some pretty big safety considerations. Lastly, we have toxic hazardous wastes. The toxicity characteristic of a waste is determined primarily by having a lab analyze a representative sample of waste using a test called the Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure, or TCLIP. The results of the test are compared to 40 constituents, 8 heavy metals, 10 pesticides, and 22 organic chemicals. The TCLIP test is designed to simulate what would leach from waste in a landfill over a 100-year period. The test can show if the waste is dangerous to the environment or not. If you look at the handbook or in the regulations, there are levels that, if reached, will make a waste a listed waste for the toxicity characteristic. For example, benzene has a regulatory level of 0.5 milligrams per liter. That's a fairly small amount. If your waste contains 0.5 milligrams per liter or more of benzene, then your waste would be a characteristic hazardous waste for benzene and would use the waste code D018. Keep in mind that milligram per liter is the same as parts per million. Parts per billion is the same as micrograms per liter. When we deal with chemicals, the concentration is often expressed in milligrams per liter or parts per million, and that's bad for the environment. However, parts per billion or micrograms per liter, that's bad for humans. We've reached the final step in our hazardous waste determination. EPA allows states to go above and beyond RCRA. So Oregon has added some Oregon-only hazardous wastes. Keep in mind, if you have a listed or a characteristic waste, you cannot have a state-only waste. Oregon-only hazardous wastes are specific to Oregon and are designed to control disposal of wastes above and beyond RCRA. These include 3% or greater concentration of P-listed wastes and their residues, 10% or greater concentration of U-listed wastes and their residues. It also includes some things like nerve agents and mustard gases because of the Umatilla Army Depot. And there's some non-RCRA listed pesticides as well. Now let's do a hazardous waste determination together. We have a spent carbon tetrachloride and grease that was used for degreasing, and now time to get rid of it. The first question we need to ask is it a solid waste? Well, we know we're disposing of it, and we know that it's spent. So yes, it is a solid waste. Next, we need to ask, is the waste excluded or exempt from RCRA regulations? You might not remember the answer to that, but you can always look it up in the regulations. And for this one, it's not. Next, we need to find out if this is a listed hazardous waste. If you look in the handbook or the regulations under F001, you'll find carbon tetrachloride. We know that it's spent, so it meets the listing for F001. Next, we'll look at, is it a characteristic hazardous waste? And if you remember, it can be both listed and characteristic. So we don't really have enough information yet to know if it's ignitable or reactive, corrosive, or toxic. So what we do is we look at the SDS and we find out that there isn't a flash. So it doesn't have that less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit for ignitable. It's not corrosive. However, there's 25% carbon tetrachloride, and we know that from the process, we didn't dilute it in any way. So we are going to have a D019, and we know that because if you look at the toxicity characteristic table, either in the handbook or the regulations, you'll see the listing, and we know that our waste is above that regulatory limit. Next, we ask, is this a state-only hazardous waste? But since we know we have both a characteristic and a listed, it cannot be a state-only as well. Lastly, we ask ourselves, did we use knowledge or analysis to get here? We used knowledge. We used the SDS. We knew that the process made the degreasing carbon tetrachloride spent. So knowledge is what we used, and the waste codes that it receives is D019 and F001. DEQ offers free technical assistance to hazardous waste generators. We can help you work on compliance and staying in compliance, or pollution prevention so you don't even create the hazardous waste in the first place. Technical assistance is non-regulatory. That means we're not there to find violations and charge you fees. We're there to help you improve. We want you to save money, time, and resources. Visit our website at oregon.gov/DEQ to learn more and find the technical advisor in your area.